I'm joined now in studio by homelessness campaigner Father Peter McVerry, by financial analyst Karl Dieter and by Owen O'Sullivan, Professor in Social Policy at Trinity College. Peter McVerry, if I could come to you first. You've been dealing with this area a long time. How bad are things now?
Well, things are worse now than I've ever experienced them. I think I have never before encountered so many people living on the streets, never encountered so much frustration amongst homeless people because they see no way out of it. I had a mother rang me this morning. Herself and her child slept in a car last night. I have other families have rung me. They've put their children into care because they can't look after them. Others have the children living with the granny while they go into while the parents go into separate homeless hostels. It's a situation that, in my experience, is unprecedented. I think we have a huge crisis, and as the report says, there's no sense of urgency. You know, if we had another foot and mouth crisis, or if we had an Ebola outbreak in Ireland, there'd be crisis cabinet meetings being held every day of the week. And the excuse that we don't have the money to solve it wouldn't be tolerated. I think we have a similar crisis. We have thousands of people who are homeless, frustrated, some of them suicidal, coming to me, very suicidal. We have whole families living in appalling accommodation, and there doesn't seem to be any sense of crisis or urgency about this at all.
And the problem is affecting people that previously wouldn't have found themselves homeless.
Vast majority of people coming home now, homeless now, never for one moment thought they would ever be homeless, as they're losing their private rented accommodation because they can't afford the rent. Some of them have been working all their lives. It never dawned on them they would ever become homeless. Most people have an image of homeless people as either drug users or alcoholics or people with mental health problems. That's changing very rapidly. It never really was true. Some did, of course, but that is changing very rapidly. The majority of homeless people now have no more problems than you or I, except they can't afford to pay the rent.
OK, that's the problem. What's the solution?
I would propose an immediate and temporary rent freeze for maybe 6 months. We need to stem the flow of people coming from the private rented sector into homelessness. A temporary, maybe 6-month rent freeze would give a bit of breathing space in order to look at what more effectively could be done. But we need to do something urgently now.
That's obviously not going to be popular with landlords, with people renting out accommodation.
It's anything you propose, there's going to be downsides for some people. I don't think a 6-month rent freeze would do inestimable damage to any landlord. But it does give a little bit of breathing space to look at alternative options. I don't see any other alternatives we need action, and we need action before Christmas. We need action now, and I don't see any alternative action that could stem that flow into homelessness coming from the private rented sector. OK,
Karl Dieter, rent control even as a temporary measure?
Well, I agree that we have a crisis. I think that part of the issue is that a lot of people with these problems don't vote or get onto their TD nearly enough, and it gives the politicians a way to pass over it. It was the likes of the Labour Party, who I would have thought would be first in line to try and help people at the lower end, who stood over things like cuts in rent supplement, and it's really quite disgraceful. But the idea of a compassionate policy could have very cruel outcomes, because a 6-month rent freeze probably won't do inestimable, or I can't remember the word, sorry, won't do inestimable damage, but it also probably won't work, because tenancies are determined normally on a year-to-year basis. So if you're in a tenancy now, you can't change your contract. We saw that even on commercial contracts with upward-only rent reviews. It's not possible for the state to go in and break that contract on the tenant's behalf. Now, that means that it's only people who are coming into the market that will benefit from this rent freeze. But they're coming into the market where the price is already set. They're not being told this will be set at 2013 levels. So I think that really the solution here is to get into what the answer is, and don't have a situation where someone has a thermometer and they say, look, your temperature's going up, you're clearly sick, so we say, right, we're going to cap your temperature at 40 degrees, your temperature can get no worse. In fact, you're only looking at the symptom. The disease itself is a broken housing market that needs more supply, more investment, and needs it quickly.
Sure, but housing supply is going to take some time to get going. I mean, the government has plans
So what we need is something that will get us through 3 years, What that something is could be huge funding towards emergency accommodation. At the moment, the likes of Dublin City Council are looking to reduce emergency accommodation, in particular that which is offered by the private sector, which has come in to do a job that wasn't being done by the state. I think that we've got a lot of dereliction in the city that could be rapidly transformed into use. I think maybe rowing back on some of the changes in building regulations that took a lot of pre-63 buildings out, because that low-end accommodation, not everybody wants to live in it, but it beats living in the street.
So
and for a lot of people,
we're dealing with the law of unintended consequences there.
Exactly. There was a lot of victims out of this.
Okay. Owen O'Sullivan, Professor of Social Policy at Trinity. What's your view on this?
There's a number of views, but I think just on the private rental sector, I think it's clear that we have to have a philosophical stance on what we understand the private rental sector to do. Either we think of the private rental sector and the units in the private rental sector as an asset that's owned by the landlord and can be disposed of whenever the landlord wants to do so, where rents can be increased at the whim of the landlord because it's simply a market-based system, or we conceptualise private rental housing as a home for people. And the policies that stem from that are very different from the policies that stem from thinking of the private rental sector as an asset belonging to the landlord. We have an opportunity at the moment to radically change the way in which the private rental sector operates. We started that process in 2004 with the Residential Tenancies Act, which brought in very limited security of tenure. At this stage, we need to move beyond the concept of security of tenure to the concept of secure occupancy for tenants in the private rental sector, which is about getting access to the sector, having rent certainty within the tenancy, having much greater enhanced security of tenure. Unless we've much greater enhanced security of tenure in the sector, increasing rent caps and various other things will ameliorate the situation in the short term, but in the long run will not fundamentally deal with the issue.
But how can you have security of tenure if rents keep going up?
Well, you can have security of tenure, but within the security of tenure, within secure occupancy, you need to have rent certainty within that. At the moment, what happens is landlords got very high rents up till 2007, rents plummeted, they're now back up again. For both landlord and tenant, having that rent certainty is much better for both parties and for the sector as a whole. At the moment...
So, sorry, I'm not quite sure I follow you. So would you advocate controlling rents? Or
yeah, well, effectively rent certainty I think is a more neutral term than rent control. And I think
it's effectively the same thing.
But it's slightly more subtle, but it does capture some of those, the issues around ensuring that people can stay in the private rental sector. The difficulty at the moment is, as it was 10 years ago, when any attempt is made to regulate the sector, there's a backlash from the landlords who say, if you regulate the sector, as was predicted 10 years ago, the private rental sector will collapse. It didn't collapse. The sector doubled in size between 2001 and 2011. So regulating the market doesn't have the perverse or adverse effect that many commentators suggest it will have. I would suggest by regulating the market at the moment, more generally, not just from the short term, but in the long run, because even having a short-term measure, we'll be back to the same situation this time next year unless we have a fundamental reform of the private rental sector. Yes, we need to do something in the short term, but over the long run, we'll continuously have these cycles of crisis unless we fundamentally reform that sector.
Carol?
Yeah, I think rent certainty is just a fluffy word for the ugly stepsister, which is called rent control. The fact is, we didn't go for rent certainty or rent control or whatever branding you want to put on it back, 3 years ago. Actually, what they did is Joan Burton stood over cuts to rent allowance. So she stood over that policy.
But
so
rents
the
were falling at the time, weren't they?
Precisely. So we didn't have this conversation. This is only a conversation we have when rents are rising. Private rents, if you look at the Central Statistics Office, are back where they were in 2003, 2004. Rents by the state are actually up 80%. So if somebody wants to lead by example and cap rents, the sector that needs to do it is the local authorities and the like.
The argument about rent supplement, though, is if you start increasing rent supplement, won't landlords simply pocket the increase?
You've got rising prices irrespective of what they're doing with rent supplements, so I don't know that argument necessarily holds. The other thing is, any time that you get guaranteed prices into the future, you pay a premium for it. Like that's the case in mortgages, the case any kind of thing that you buy far into the future and you want a guaranteed price. So you'd actually look at almost paying even higher again to get this certainty, and it's flawed. The PRTB, the Private Residential Tenancies Board, only released a report on this last month. They are far from being a mouthpiece for landlords. They said that it wouldn't work. The academic research showed it wouldn't work. The European Council, the European Central Bank, the supply is the problem.
That's not the case. The PRTB didn't say that. A consultant they employed made that argument. There are endless counter-arguments to the argument put forward by that report. There are examples all the way across Europe of having secure occupancy and rent certainty, and those markets work.
Okay, Peter, some resistance to the idea there of what you're advocating, but what you're advocating is a temporary measure.
Obviously, the resistance to a permanent sort of rent control, I think, would be fierce. But as Owen says, rent control works in other countries. It works in Germany. It works in Netherlands. There's no major problems there about it working. So I think some form of rent control. If the government don't want to increase the rent allowance and they don't want to bring in rent control, what on earth are they going to do? They have a crisis on their hands and they're sitting there looking at it, wondering what they're going to do.
We were told in the budget that there'd be more money for social housing, and obviously
that's
the problem.
Terrific.
It will take time.
That's terrific. It takes 3 years. We need something and we need it now. Second problem is we have a growing number of people sleeping on the street. You know, solving rough sleeping is not rocket science. All you need is a few buildings, do some renovations, put in a few beds and employ some staff, and you get people off the streets. If we can't even do that in Ireland 2014, when we can spend 100 million taking away the traffic lights at Newlands Cross, when we can give 500 million to ensuring that broadband can be put into every single home in the country, and we can't get people off the streets, that is absurd.
Owen, just very briefly, what's your view of this, putting money into hostels?
Hostels don't work. It is a waste of money building more hostels. We spend an inordinate amount of money on homeless services, not on homeless people, on homeless services that don't effectively work. We have three issues at the moment. There is, believe it or not, a long-term strategy to end homelessness in Ireland. Many people, including Peter, are very sceptical of that. But we are one of the few countries in Europe that does have a long-term strategy to end homelessness. So while I know there are cynics about it, I still would prefer to live in a country that has a strategy to end homelessness than live in a country that doesn't. Building more hostels will not work. It's about providing secure occupancy for homeless people, or people who are formerly homeless. Simply building more hostels will not answer the problem.
Okay,
I agree with that, but we need a short term, we need to get people off the streets.
Okay,
well, we need to do it tonight.
On that note of agreement, we'll end that. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. Miriam.